So Liam, we are here to talk about the things that you really absolutely need to get right when you make a podcast in order to make it successful.
That's right, Meera. At Auddy Business Solutions, we put a lot of time and effort and resources into developing a simple path to podcasting for companies. And I think there's really plenty of stuff we can talk about in terms of strategy, content and purpose that'll give people a really clear view of what they need to do to launch into podcasting.
A lot of people just pick up a mic and start recording and then post whatever they've made to the internet. But actually there's so much more that needs to go on before you even press record. You need to have a purpose before you go into your podcast. Can you talk to me about why a purpose is important?
Yeah, I think it's critical. If you're starting out on this path, making podcasts, whether it's for internal or external audience, you really need to know why before you start. And that then defines everything else that you do. So what's the purpose? Who am I speaking to? What's the tone of voice I'm going to use? What's the audience I'm trying to reach? And once you've kind of clarified that in your own head and you've given yourself that purpose, everything else sort of follows then from that. But that kind of content planning and the thought that you put into it, it's really like, when you're building a building, that if you get the foundations right and you pour the concrete over it, it's rock solid. But if you haven't done the work and the foundations are not right, it's just not going to stand up over time.
That was a good analogy. But that's a good point. What if people don't know what their purpose is?
So I think there are people who can help them. So, we can help in terms of strategy and purpose. That's one of the things that we do. But, you've got to kind of work through the process yourself as well. So, and there are critical questions along the way. Is this something for our own audience? It's a great way to communicate with your staff. So, if your company is of a size and scale where you can't just pop into the kitchen, we'll have a quick meeting. This is a really good way to personally address people. And, the thing to remember with podcasts as well is that you're speaking directly into their ears. It's a really immersive experience. So a well-crafted, personal touch, personal feel to a staff announcement or just staff communication, letting people hear different voices from the company. That's a really powerful tool. And if you use that correctly, you really would start to pull the threads together of your company and communicate internally. But it's also a really powerful tool from an external point of view, that if you've got good things happening with your company, you need to tell people. And this gives you a space where you define the content, you set the tone, you make it as immersive or as warm as you want it to be, but you're speaking directly to an audience who's interested in what you're doing.
So knowing who your audience is immensely important, because you can shape your content towards them. Can you talk to me about why else knowing who you're talking to is so important?
I think it's one of the things that, there's a huge difference between somebody standing on a stage with a microphone or a loudspeaker and shouting at a crowd, and somebody sitting at a pub table and talking to you. And that tone of voice is critical. So understanding the audience you're speaking to and getting the tone of voice right really makes a big difference in how they hear what you're saying as well. So, if it's a corporate podcast and you're just shouting about, edition 2.0 that's coming out tomorrow and that has 6 things that are slightly better, it's just going to wash over people's heads and they won't get engaged with it. But if you find a way to tell the story of that, how you came about that edition, what the reasons are for the changes, and maybe the people in the company who worked on it and have put time and effort into it, that turns into a story that people are actually going to be enthused about and engaged with. And it's just a totally different experience.
And you mentioned these internal podcasts. So a company who wants to talk to their employees, for example, that kind of translates to private podcasts in some way. Can you talk about what a private podcast is?
Yeah, so I think when you start to do an internal podcast, it's a different kind of mindset. So this is not necessarily something you want everybody in the street to be listening to. You're not putting this into the podcast charts up against Joe Rogan. So really, for an internal podcast to work well, we would recommend a private network. So on that network, you can manage who has access to it. So you can narrow it down to people in particular teams or the whole company. You can really closely watch who's watching and who's listening and who's engaging. And it just gives you much more control over where the message goes and targeting that message and making sure that, if it's an important communication, you want to know that your staff are actually listening to it. So those kind of analytics are really critical in this as well. So a platform that does all that for you, that gives you a really clear picture of how successful your podcast is a pretty important piece of the puzzle. And that's something that Auddy Business Solutions can do.
And being able to track those goals, whether that's talking to a specific group within your organization, that's really important. How do you mentioned these platforms and all the analytics that are available to you. Can you talk about how having access to those analytics actually helps you measure whether you're successful in the goals that you've set out to achieve?
Yeah, so analytics have become more and more important in business, and we've all seen the sort of Facebook social media analytics that show you if something counts as a view if people have watched 3 seconds of it, and you can make video content that just disappears, that people maybe put on but don't pay attention to. With podcasting, all of the trends and all of the research around podcasting shows that people really pay close attention to it. Most people tend to listen to it on their own. They tend to listen to it on headphones, and you'll be able to follow exactly what point they drop out of the podcast, and you'll be able to follow who's subscribed to it, who's liked it, and the kind of engagement that you're getting with it. So it's quite a transparent medium, but it's also a medium that really rewards that effort that you put into content and into the material. So, you need to be looking at how the episodes are performing. Do episodes get to the point 10 minutes in, or 15 minutes in, or 20 minutes in? Are there things that you could do and adjust that would make people stay for longer? Are you telling them what's coming up? So there's a whole load of little structural techniques and storytelling techniques that we can use to pull people right through to the podcast, so they're coming to the end of it, enjoying it, and looking for the next one.
Okay, and I guess all of those analytics are only useful if you set those goals beforehand. So you need to know very clearly what success looks like for your company. Can you talk a little bit about those goals that people might set?
Yeah, I think that's something we can help with as well, in terms of what's your strategic aim, what are you hoping to achieve? We can sort of break it down, and again, that kind of content planning is critical as well. That if we're looking at a 12-part or a 24-part series, what are the areas we want to cover? Are we setting up recurring features in them so people will know that they want to come back and hear what's happening this week in engineering, or whatever it might be in terms of your internal podcast? But if that just saying we got 10,000 listens this week isn't enough, really. You've got to be clear before you start. So if it's that every employee has heard the podcast at some point, or if it's that the podcast is charted, if it's an external podcast, or you've got to be really clear about why you're doing it, and then you can measure the success of it. And that's that frames how much you put in terms of investment, that frames who you put as the host. There's a whole load of factors that come into it. So you need to know before you start what success looks like. And then that purpose and that content will drive that forward, and you can measure it as you go, which is critical.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. I think we've learned a lot about how to make a successful podcast.